Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ian Bernhoft. I'm the coordinator of the Humanities Forum, at which you are sitting right now. This is where it begins. The Forum is an initiative of the Humanities program, which offers the Providence College community the opportunity to learn from leading scholars, thinkers, journalists, professionals from around the country and indeed around the world. So here you can engage in the intellectual life outside of class, deepen your appreciation for the humanities, and encounter new perspectives. Today's talk is our annual Ex Corde Ecclesiae, didn't realize I had to say that fast, Ex Corde Ecclesiae lecture, which we have annually on the topics pertaining to Catholic social teaching and natural law. This is endowed by a generous donation from a supporter of the Humanities program, and we're very grateful. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our speaker, but let me first preview what you should expect at the Humanities Forum. So, our guest will speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we're going to have Q&A time, which will wrap up at 4:45 sharp. And then after that, we'll head down the hall to the great room, where there's a nice reception laid out. So what you need to do, and most of you are already doing a great job of this, is close those laptops down so you can fully attend to what's happening in the room. Secondly, once we're in the Q&A, you, the student, need to ask the first question. That's an ironclad rule. So be thinking as you're listening, what do I want to have clarified? What am I curious about? What do I want to know more on? And then lastly, you really should head down the hall and avail yourself of the feast down there. So, okay. Today's speaker. So we're very pleased to welcome today Dr. F. Russell Hittinger, who is a distinguished scholar and leading authority on Catholic social thought. He serves as the executive director at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. And at CUA, he's also the director of the program on Catholic political thought. Dr. Hittinger's work has been instrumental in advancing the understanding and application of Catholic social doctrine in contemporary contexts. His research and writings have explored the foundations of natural law, the relationship between faith and reason, and the role of religion in public life. He's taught at a number of universities around the world, but he says most enjoyably as a Randall Chair at Providence College in 2007, 2008. This last year, he was honored to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars and the Aquinas Medal from the American Catholic Philosophical Association. His most recent book, which is apparently coming out sometime this month and is on the screen before you, is called On the Dignity of Society. It's a collection of essays highlighting the importance of defending both the dignity of the human person and the dignity of society. And I won't say anything more about it, because I think it might pertain to what he's going to be talking to you today. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Hittinger.
Thank you. Is that all?
It's about to be.
I turn this one on. Is it on? Okay. By the way, I took what? It's not on. Testing? Better? Okay. Yeah, I taught law and philosophy for years in Oklahoma. And your comment about the laptop, I have an interesting story. So I was teaching a law class, and I always said, shut down your laptops. You'll learn faster if you just listen. And about 20 minutes into my lecture, I saw a student in back flip the screen. He started waving. Shut your laptop down, please. And he said, no, I've got to tell you something important. Okay, what is it? There's a tornado about 5 miles from here. It's heading this way. And it was correct. We all had to evacuate. Before I begin, this is the cover to the new book. I want to explain something about the cover. I think there's an explanation inside the cover, but I'll give it to you. That's a Van Gogh, The title of it is Il Café, and I don't know whether it's Paris, but it's French. A nighttime scene of a little piazza and roadway. The first thing to notice, the light is over here, and here we see Jesus dressed as a Parisian waiter in white. You can see the cross in back, and he's celebrating the Last Supper with women of the night, with the prostitutes. Unfortunately, they had to crop the painting because right here, Judas is escaping into the bar. He can't take what's happening here. Right? And down the dark street, not properly illuminated here, is Lucifer on a horse coming into the little piazza. I'm going to have fun explaining that as long as I'm on a tour of talking about my book. Those of you who have read George Bernanos' Diary of a Country Priest, if you've read that little novel, you might recall the conversation between the younger and the older priest who are in the rectory together. And the older priest says, that famous encyclical of Leo XIII Rerum Novarum, you can read that without turning a hair like any instruction for keeping Lent. But when it was published, sonny boy, it was an earthquake. And I've always loved that line because probably today people don't think of it as an earthquake or anything but a footnote. But the older priest was right on this. Actually, it was printed in full by the New York Times. The only other encyclical that was printed by the New York Times was Pacem in Terris, 1963, John the 23rd. When John Paul II celebrated the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, he referred to Rerum Novarum not as an earthquake, but something that gave citizenship status to the church. That is, after centuries and centuries, the Catholic tradition was finally talking about social facts on the ground. It was entering a conversation that concerned everyone, not just church and state. Rerum Novarum is elegantly simple and concise compared to the mammoth encyclicals we have today, which are usually 4 or 5 times longer than Rerum Novarum. You can read it as a first read in 35 or 40 minutes. He makes a simple set of points that are philosophical, understandable, and really kind of wraps up the subject to be spoken about at that time. Begins with the famous quote from John Damascene that Thomas puts at the very beginning of the secunda pars of the Summa. So, first part of the Summa is God and his works. The secunda pars is man and his works. Third part is God, man, and his works. But the quote from Damascene is introducing the largest single part of the Summa. Made unto the image and likeness of God, the human agent is provident both for himself and others. That's how Rerum Novarum begins. It begins with an anthropological principle. What kind of an actor or agent is a human being? And he moves very, very quickly to work is human action. It's dignified, and it's of tremendous moral value, not just economic value. Third point, to acquire property through work and to acquire it as one's own is a necessary condition for such action, because work is not just acquiring something, but it's acquiring it in order to give it to others. That's the dignity of work. It's not just changing matter or increasing your bank account. It's getting something that you can give as a personal gift to others. And the first recipient of that gift is being provident for your family. So the entire encyclical is rooted in the very first two social points of Catholic social teaching. Human action has dignity. It's not just reaction. It's not just efficiency. It's being able to act according to being in the image and likeness of God. Work is dignified, and it's for the sake of other people, beginning naturally, in the natural order of things, the family, the first bond, the first social bond, and the most persistent social bond upon which all other societies depend in varying degrees. Next point, there is a natural right to form associations other than marriage, church, and state. This is where we get the doctrine of subsidiarity from. To form associations to protect the well-being of the family and voluntary organizations, in this case, something like Knights of Columbus, and where Catholic workers get together. They found an insurance company for the benefit of all, and that is not reducible to the state. Final point, it's the role of government, the civil order, to protect human action and to protect the family and to protect voluntary associations that further those things, including something like collective bargaining. Bam, bam, bam. From anthropology to morals to labor to family and to voluntary associations. Back then, they would have been called quasi-guilds. Interestingly, though, over centuries, before the 19th century, when Leo issues this in 1891, this Catholic social teaching was not very systematically organized. It tended to be gathered under the rubric of what was called Doctrina Civilis. And civilis means something political. Not Doctrina Socialis, but Doctrina Civilis, because it was common teaching that polity in the natural order of things is the most comprehensive society that contains other societies, such as marriage and family, voluntary societies, and so forth. In fact, the term Doctrina Civilis was still intact at the time Leo wrote this encyclical, even though the state only has a minor part in Rerum Novarum, an important part, but a minor part. So what I want to first try to explain is what the difference is, and it's not a revolution, but it's definitely a big change, when the church starts speaking of its social teaching as Doctrina Socialis and not Civilis. Okay. Now, of course, for centuries upon centuries, the church had plenty to say about social institutions and practices. church and hierarchy, religious orders, their properties and immunities, marriage. And by the way, if you start reading these kinds of encyclicals back to early 18th century, you know what the biggest single issue is? Dueling. There's at least 5 encyclicals on dueling. And that problem goes all the way back to chivalry and the church's teaching about, how to put it, murder for fun, is the best way to put it. And they were called encyclicals because, as that word suggests, a cycle, the teaching was put into letters that were passed around, cycled, to a certain set of bishops in a particular ecclesiastical region or country. The new thing of the 19th century is that this tradition gets sort of formalized now and made more powerful by 2 inventions: newspapers and telegraph. Leo XIII could take his advisors, his team of thinkers, and they would seclude themselves for a week in the Vatican. They would hammer out an encyclical, and the next morning it's on the telegraph and it's being printed in London. This is a revolution. Not just an old thing passing a letter around, in Bavaria, but it becomes international. Leo is in newspapers too. But Leo is also the first pope to use a telephone. And he had a phonograph. And you can go online and actually find a clip of him introducing the last castrato of the Sistine Choir. By the way, one of his first acts as Pope was to ban castrati. I think it's the beginning of the Thomistic revival, right there. But the fact is, it was not formally denominated as Doctrina Socialis. That doesn't happen until Leo's student, Pius XI, says he inherited Doctrina Socialis. If you use the term back then of Doctrina Civilis, you're talking about what we would call, with some simplification, church and state. The 2 jurisdictional authorities that predominate in Catholic countries. Footnote. Be careful when you read these encyclicals, because about the same time as Rerum Novarum, many European sociologists and social thinkers began using the term civil society for everything that stands between government and the individual. That's not the right term for this tradition. It's called Doctrina Socialis. Okay, I think I can show you the difference. One reason it took a while for the church to talk about social life just on its own terms is that, compared to us today, in which every social fact is contested, beginning with marriage, and you can keep on going. Actually, most of our debates leading up to the election are not really political anymore. It's just enormous and complicated disagreements and so forth about social facts. But once upon a time, not that long ago, marriage was not a deeply contested issue. Except for Gnostic groups in the Middle Ages like Albigensians, no one seriously challenged the social predicates of marriage. One man, one woman, free of impediments, who make religiously recognizable vows and are entitled to raise a family. The Reformation did not challenge that. Catholics and Protestants in the Reformation did not fight over that. They fought over jurisdiction, marriage tribunals, courts of the king or courts of the church. In fact, that was the beginning of the revolution in England and in the German lands. They always made a quick move, not to studying the social facts, which were taken for granted, but the contest over jurisdiction. And this was true as well for problems of economic corporations, guilds, educational institutions, the organization of exploration and colonization in the New World. Once upon a time, they argued about what was civil. That is, how social facts end up in whose courts and whose jurisdiction. And plus the fact they had inherited Aristotle and Aquinas, which means that to say political is to say the most comprehensive, at least naturally the most comprehensive society. And we have both church and state. Church is called civil because it has jurisdiction. Plus, there were still papal states until Leo's time. Until the 1860s, there were still papal states in which the church had both civil and ecclesiastical jurisdiction over the same people. So what changed? What were the new things, Rerum Novarum? Well, Leo was born in 1810, before the demise of Napoleon, and didn't die until 1903. He was a real man of the 19th century. He saw these changes. The 19th century drew the attention of statesmen, prelates, lawyers, social scientists. Social science was born in the 19th century. Durkheim, Marx, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The revolutions that spread from France to the rest of Europe, and from Europe to the New World, South America, caused enormous, or at least brought attention to enormous social problems. In German lands, during Leo's lifetime, in 2 generations, we're talking about mid-19th century, 70% of the population of Germany moved from rural habitation into cities. Cities were overwhelmed. We had impoverished populations in the cities, also impoverished populations in rural areas. By the time Leo was up and running, every continent in the world had railroads that had penetrated to the very center of the continent and completely changed economic life. No one could grow crops for a local economy anymore. Crops were grown for the sake of shipping it the produce to England, which then maybe sends it over to German factories. It's the age also of mandatory education. Who controls education? Yeah, economies of scale were interrupted, if not destroyed. Now children sort of belong to the government because of mandatory education, impoverishment. The one thing the 19th century, after Napoleon, was relatively free of was wars. That would change when we move into the 20th century. But there was a general sense by 1891 that society was the problem. And the state was not doing much to solve it. Remember the famous line of Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto? All that is solid melts into the air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life, and his relations with his own kind. Everyone agreed. Society was out of whack. So, in the middle of the 19th century, Catholics, in very impressive numbers, and we're talking about educated Catholics, both clerical and lay, began to study social problems. Archbishop Paci, that'll be Leo XIII, was Archbishop of Perugia, kind of in the middle of Italy, slightly to the east. And he founded the academy, the Perugian Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas, that when he became Pope in 1878, was moved to the Vatican, and to this day is the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas. It's the second oldest pontifical academy. The oldest one is the Academy of Science, and the first director of it was Galileo. St. Thomas is the second, and that became his workshop, first in Perugia and then in Rome, for studying social problems. Several Catholics, rather famous, Topperelli being a great one, Luigi Topperelli, had been developing philosophically quite sophisticated understandings of subsidiarity and so forth. And as I said, Leo had plenty of time because he had lost the Papal States. And so when he was a prisoner in the Vatican in these years, what else to do but write encyclicals, right? And he had a great team. So here are the principles. This is in some, but you'll get a better sense if you buy the book. Don't be like Judas fleeing into the bar. Buy the book. We begin with this very famous statement of Aquinas. Prima Secundae, question 96, Article 8, 26, Article 8. We should measure the love of different persons according to the different kinds of union. So a man is more loved in matters touching that particular union in which respect of which he is loved. And again, comparing love to love, we should compare one union with another. This is the beginning of the Leonine tradition. We have to study not just all of the effects of cohabitation or social unions. We have to understand what the unions are first. We want to see, and we ask these questions. Who belongs to whom? Remember when I was maybe a sophomore in high school, that's all we cared about. Who belongs to whom? That's back when people dated. Okay. Second question, what is the bond? Is that they're both on the same soccer team? Or they're going out to dance? Or what's the bond of this belonging? For what ends? The bond is always the form. You've got to find it. And that form finalized. You've got to find that. And then, in the order of justice, what do the members of a social bond owe to one another? It's a question of justice. So the adjective socialis has to modify a noun, a bond, a principle of unity. And there are different kinds of principles of unity. The greatest principle of unity is substance, like soul and body. The body belongs to the soul, not the other way around. When I get up in the morning, I don't have to give a command to the body to be my body. It can't talk back, actually. So the greatest natural unity is form, matter, in the case of a human being, soul and body. There's a bond that's irrevocable. You can always rely on it. At the other extreme, Thomas refers to a unity of composition, kind of aggregation. So I want to build a sandbox for my children. I order sand. The truck pulls up, dumps 2 piles of sand. Now, there is a unity in each pile. I can say, this pile versus that pile. But there's no intrinsic order to it. It will soon be something other than a pile of sand. Okay. And then there are more distinctions, and this is something that very much worried late 18th and 19th century thinkers. We could have composition that crosses another kind of threshold. The popes and the Romans used to call it the piazza. So there's 5,000 of us in the Piazza Navona. It's a crowd. No one intends a society, either by way of form or end, but everyone is social in the sense of intersubjectivity. Once we introduce intersubjectivity into a composite unity, I'm aware that you're aware, and you're aware that I'm aware that you're aware. And that's why you go to the piazza. Actually, it's fun, unless you're in a traffic jam. Okay. So, but still, the distinctions that are made by Leo and his successors would be that what counts as being a society is not just the piazza. Because we can't say who belongs to whom, or what is the bond, or what are the ends, or what they owe to one another. But the ontology of social order is found in what Thomas calls and Leo calls unity of order. It's neither substance nor mere aggregation. That is, 2 or more individuals, depending on the society we're talking about, have a common bond and a common end. And the first one that we notice is marriage. By the way, it's still happening. Marriage. It's a form of order that includes a way of life. One lives in it. You don't just have it, you live in it. Footnote. One of the best essays ever written on this was by Karl Wojtyła in 1958. It has recently been published by Catholic University of America, and it's called The Person, Subject, and Community. Because the community is a person, not a substantial person, but a person. Common form and common end. Okay. You will also, as you enter into this tradition, need to know that the 2 best social encyclicals ever written were not on the state. Leo's first social encyclical is Arcanum Divinae on marriage. It's great. All these distinctions I've just made are in Arcanum Divinae. And Pius XI, his student, in Casti Connubii, rehearses it. Writes his own encyclical following up on Leo because things had happened in the meantime. Like contraception, artificial contraception. In any case, you start with the bonds, and the first natural bond, besides your soul and body, is marriage. When this tradition speaks of necessary societies, why call them necessary? Because they're not completely arbitrary. If I join a soccer team, that's an arbitrary society in that We all have to choose to be in it or not in it, or we can leave it. Sports teams, corporations of all kinds, motorcycle clubs, or even joining the Knights of Columbus. Those are called arbitrary societies because although they have a bond and an end, you don't live in them. There's no natural necessity. But in the case of marriage and polity and church, these are necessary societies. The bond and the end. Why? Because of neediness. It's the best word to begin with, neediness. Without marriage, families would be scattered. 4-year-old children are pretty needy, and they need the domestic order. They're not going to turn out well, probably, without that domestic order. And man and woman have a neediness. They've got to procreate together. They need each other just in the marriage. And for church, well, what is the neediness of the political order? Safety and justice, chiefly. Safety and justice. We need justice beyond domestic life. I live outside of Newark. Like in the old days, if your sister was mistreated by someone, what do? You go break his knees, break his legs. And as Aristotle himself was pointing out in politics, and Hillary Clinton is wrong on this, villages are very dangerous places. If you live in an order where you don't transcend first and second cousins, yeah. And the neediness of the church, that society is the deepest of all. Forgiveness of sins and salvation of the soul. Needy. But necessity is also excellence. That is, if you enter into these three societies, with any good fortune on this, you achieve an excellence. Now, a lot of married people find that the excellence is most obvious when the grandchildren arrive. The payoff. Well, I don't have to explain it to people who have grandchildren. Pius XI, Pius XII, and onward start talking about the Ordo Socialis, or Doctrina Socialis, because the church had become very interested in things that are just not reducible to church and state battles. Who belongs to whom? What's the bond? For what end or ends? What do they owe each other in the order of justice? The members. Okay. This was, in my view, which I explain in greater detail in the book, is that this was an enormous leap forward, to borrow Mao Zedong on that. It was a leap forward because the social dislocations of the 19th century and the international collapse of the economy were not merely church-state problems, nor were the conflicts of ideologies at the time. The state usually thinks of management and control. That's how to think like a state. But we have problems that are appearing into the 20th century in which we have to understand the social units and the social bonds. So by shifting the adjective, slowly but surely, from civilis to socialis, the encyclical tradition was actually having to deal with real facts. It was not just a lawyer's issue of canonical and civil lawyers arguing back and forth about who had jurisdiction. It was an effort to understand reality, social reality. And this was a fairly well disseminated tradition. But once again, telegraph, newspaper, radio. Both clerics and educated laity were reading this stuff. You say, but why didn't they change it to Socialis when Leo first became Pope in 1878? And this would take another lecture, but let me just give one crack at it. It's called the social gospel. Probably the most important Protestant theological development of the late 19th century into the 20th century was called the social gospel, which originated with a German-born but American Protestant named Walter Rauschenbusch. Rochester, New York. The social gospel was understood by its adherents, or most of its adherents, as putting to one side what they called the individualistic gospel, which is forgiveness of sins and attainment of heaven in union with Christ, in favor of a social gospel in which those parts of the New Testament that could be adapted to social issues were given priority. In other words, the job of Christians on earth is to make Hell's Kitchen safer. In fact, Rauschenbusch taught in Hell's Kitchen. And Rome was not going to go in that direction. We don't give up the eschatological gospel for talking about social change. At least not back then. Okay. But as time wore on and Pius XI became Pope after World War I, it was a done deal. Refer to this tradition as not social gospel, but social doctrine. But there was already evidence of problems. And in a word, giganticism. A problem with giganticism. See, the whole purpose of moving from civilis to socialis is to start looking at social facts. Not just hanging around with an adjective, but get the noun back too. We want to know in reality the difference between a marriage and a circus. But, boy, we move into the 20th century with the World War and the Great Depression. The facts become gigantic. And especially into the 1950s after World War II, after the war, I remember, because I was a kid then, well, actually almost in high school, but I was a stamp collector, really avid stamp collector. I had to change my stamp book every year because roughly 40% of the nations on earth changed. It was the era of decolonization all over the world. I go, darn it. You know, I have to relick the stamps and put them in a different book under different names of countries. Immediately, well, during World War II, but just after, civil wars, more economic dislocations, Cold Wars, extraordinarily complex dependencies of Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. It was an enormous problem. And it was not easy to clearly distinguish the nature of the bonds and the exigencies that were global. But the adjective must modify a noun, even if we now call it Kenya or something else. We've got to find the bond. You know, this is the era in which we, especially at the governmental level, and we first find this phrase that's still used today, building a better world. Now, if you're dealing with massive complexities and you're thinking in mid-20th century, you want to build things. You want to bring order out of a kind of chaos. And this was the canary in the coal mine. And the canaries are Pius XII and Paul VI. By the way, two very experienced, well-trained and educated popes. Pius XII becomes Pope in 1939, about a month before World War II. Paul VI becomes Pope in 1963 after the first session of the Vatican Council. If anyone was up to the task of dealing with the massive factual complexities under the term social, these were the two guys. Very experienced both intellectually and working in the Vatican. So I'll begin with Pius XII. Family name was Pacelli. He was ordained a priest at the time of Leo XIII. In fact, on the Feast of Christ the King. Almost immediately went into Secretary of State in the Vatican, very experienced in all of the issues of collapse of Germany and other places through World War II. He issued one social encyclical. It came out about 5 weeks after the bombing of Poland. It's called Summi Pontificatus. It's a beautiful encyclical. He never wrote another one. And he was Pope until 1958. Why did the best guy in the Vatican for doing this stop writing these encyclicals, social encyclicals? 20-year silence at a very important time in history. 1945 to 1965 is a really important era. Well, he admitted to himself the social facts were too complicated. And there were too many different levels compared to what Leo was dealing with in 1891. You know, he should have been made a saint just for this fact. He stopped when he knew he couldn't do it right anymore. Rather, for the rest of his papacy, he gave very short talks in or around the Vatican on smaller issues one by one, especially medical ethics. By the way, those are collected in, I believe, a 3-volume set. You can find it right online. He gave a lot of talks, but he did not synthesize the whole thing. Couldn't do it. So he stopped. He went small. Now, for his part, Paul VI, who was born during Leo's era, all these guys are from the 19th century, all the way up through Paul VI. He was maybe the second smartest and experienced of the 20th century curialists in the Vatican. Served in the Secretary of State during the 1920s, 1954. His father was a leader of Catholic social action in Italy. Came from the north of Italy. He thought he might have a Benedictine vocation. In fact, he tried to join Salem, which then had a monastery in the north of Italy. It ended up being diocesan. He became the Pope after John the 23rd. And he issued the encyclical, Populorum Progressio, just after the council ended, 1966, he issues the encyclical. And it was on the theme of development. And I remember, because now I'm old enough in that year to be out of high school, and the liturgical changes had just about happened, or were in the process of happening. And at the kiss of peace, we turned to each other and said, "May the development be with you." The subtitle was Call to Action. And on this, he tried to say, what's needed that time in the 1960s is basically the rich nations of the world, Northern Hemisphere chiefly, the banks, the corporations, the governments, to invest in the Southern Hemisphere. Sort of like a John Kennedy theme, right? And it was not well received. It was not well received, especially in the Southern Hemisphere. This is the beginning of liberation theology. Gutierrez and others. Because when Pope Alorum Progressio came down, which seemed like a wonderfully liberal, generous, liberal in the sense of being generous policies globally, South Americans said, no, this is dependency theory. That's where the phrase comes from. That is, you think you're doing good for us, but you're ignoring our own societies. And all this is big money from Europe and North America being shoved down our throats. And when big money comes, little guys don't get to vote for anything at a certain point. So it was not well received. And it grieved Paul VI, but he never wrote another one. And he was Pope until 1978. Never wrote another one. So, on this one, I'm not guessing. Because when the 80th anniversary came on the scene of Rerum Novarum, that's 1971, everyone said, Paul VI, you've got to write a social encyclical. He said no. And he gave a reason, not in an encyclical, basically in a private letter to the Secretary of Justice and Peace. We'd call that a dicastery. It was called back then a council. And this is what he said. In the face of such widely varying situations, it's difficult for us to utter a unified message and to put forward a solution which has universal validity. Such is not our ambition, nor is it our mission. It's up to Christian communities to analyze with objectivity the situation which is proper to their own country. There's more to it, but those are the key sentences. He truly believed that from the time of Leo to his time, that social ontology was obviously true, but kind of useless. Because the problems of the world was not identifying what a marital bond is. Boy, Humanae Vitae, should have understood that one. But to understand development, poverty. And he decided that Catholic social teaching was chiefly action, not analysis, not getting the adjectives linked up with the facts, but action. There was the second canary in the coal mine. There were two Jesuits at the time during Paul VI, during Pius XII's fading years, who wrote a book on Catholic social teaching that until maybe 20 years ago was still the standard book. I recommend everyone to read it. Father Calvez and Perrin, S.J. Very interesting book in which they issued a warning. This is 1958. Without a precisely articulated objective norm, Catholic social teaching will end up being a mere bundle of social aspirations analogous to so many social systems which may be well-intentioned but which lack precision and strength. Essentially, the adjective social had lost its referent. Now, I must skip ahead. How much more time do I have? 5 minutes? About that? Okay. John Paul II had figured this out and wrote an encyclical called Ecclesia in Americum. It was after the Synod of the Americas. And in this encyclical, no, wait a minute, it was an apostolic exhortation, I suppose. He said, we need a catechism of Catholic social teaching that leaves out all of the contingents, or most of the contingent things, and zeroes back on the principles. What do we first look at or bring into view when we talk about society? And he didn't want it to be long. He wanted it to be like a Baltimore Catechism size. And he commissioned Justice and Peace to write it. Took them 5 years. It's fairly enormous. They didn't start including data from previous encyclicals until 1958. Just when the problems were pretty clear. There's no argument, no philosophical synthesis, no historical narrative. You could read the compendium backwards without any loss of meaning. It was apparently designed to be read forwards, but it is designed so you can kind of pick and choose. And we're given the appearance of a kind of continuity, but consider this. There are about 800 words touching on the issue of water. Kyoto Freshwater Treaties. The section on justice, about 500 words. It never really defends the three classic forms of justice: commutation, exchange, distribution from the social whole to the parts, or the obligation of the social parts to the whole. This is this conclusion about justice. I read it literally. A large part of the social teaching of the church is solicited and determined by important social questions to which social justice is the proper answer. But every justice is social. In other words, it's not telling you anything. Commutation is social. Marriage is commutation. Distributive justice, whole to the parts on the basis of merit or need, that's social. Obligation of the citizens or the social parts to the whole is social. It didn't turn out the way John Paul II intended. In fact, it extended the problem. Let me say right now, the catechism is much better. But the best thing that's ever been written in the post-Vatican II era is Cardinal Hofner of Vienna. Wrote and it's small, it's called Ordo Socialis. It's brilliant. You can find it online in English. So this problem of giganticism has not been solved. I'll give one last example. Fratelli tutti. In Italian, l'amicizia sociale, social friendship. But like, what friendship isn't social? We've got the problem again. I'm going to give an example. Family, in that encyclical, denotes a real family, a sociological real family, 8 times, and a metaphorical family 27 times. Oops, the nouns are getting screwed up here. The metaphors. And the very word social as an adjective modifies a real social entity 15 times, but no social entity at all 56 times. Giganticism. The family is called local. But a family's not local. I mean, they're everywhere to begin with. A family was always called particular, which means it's different than church, which is universal, and it's different than polity, which is comprehensive. So to call the first of the necessary societies local is not to track societies or social forms. It's to describe them quantitatively, here or there, big or small, local. By the way, canon law uses that term properly, because in canon law, your parish is called local because your domicile is within that parish, and the pastor of that parish is under the representative of the apostles, the bishop. It is not just localizing. It's under the category of jurisdiction. It's under the category of civilis. There. And so this is our problem. The adjectives run free. They're not being carefully done. Famous Bob Dylan song, "If dogs run free, why not me?" The social ontology is very lazy. And so I don't think there are two paradigms of Catholic social thought. This is the thing Papa Ratzinger worried about in Caritas and Veritate. No, we don't have two paradigms, but we do have a problem. And whether social teaching begins with facts on the ground and understands the normativity of those facts, or whether it's only a call to action in which we think like a state. We're trying to call people to action. We want things to get done, and that's the way a state will think about it. But that's not how we should think about it doctrinally. What was the last thing I was going to say? Well, thanks for being here. Okay.
So we have a couple of minutes for questions. When the microphone comes to you, if you can give your name and your major, your profession, before your question, that would be great.
I have one clarifying the question and then one kind of more in-depth question. So is your central argument kind of at the end of the talk that giganticism can be summed up to a problem of linguistics more than a kind of unsolvable philosophical hill, kind of uncrossable path?
Oh, good. I think we should start with what we know. And Pius XII and Paul VI understood that what the world wanted of us was the big thing, in which we don't start with what we know, or can easily know, but with international order, economic aspects of international order, war and peace, bum, 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 bum. Well, listen, even at Davos, they haven't figured this out yet. In other words, that's really difficult to have a coherent message, much less one for action. Start with what we know. The simple things, they can be learned by induction. Yeah. And I claim that Leo and his successors for quite a while did that. Start with what you know, and keep working. You should teach about what you know. It would be another way to put it. And then ask questions about what you don't know. Fine. But when you use the word family for a real family 8 times and dozens and dozens of things, it's not a family ontologically at all. Something's wrong. Or you're mixing 2 kinds of questions together. And your second point. When I began, I quoted the line from Diary of a Country Priest and followed up by John Paul II saying in Centesimus Annus that Rerum Novarum gave the church citizenship status. I think my lecture is asking you to think this. The citizenship status and tradition fit together very neatly. Because citizenship status, according to the usual protocols of thought and action, are simply for action. Not just propaganda, but action. Your job is to, how to put it, enthuse, to get something done. And whereas doctrine, even in a looser sense of the term than the Nicene Creed, is to teach. It is to say what you know. And when you get to the giganticism problem, less and less of what we know, and more of call to action. I think that's what I'm trying to point out.
Hi, thank you so much for this great lecture. I'm Monty James. I'm a grad student at Brown in history. And I had a question about sort of this giganticism problem and the timeline that you started with Taparelli and Leo XIII, moving to Pius XI, and I'm specifically thinking of Quadragesimo Anno, 1931. Do you think this giganticism problem really starts earlier, so it's already in the 1920s and 30s, and specifically this relationship between society and the individual, when all of a sudden sort of citizenship status can't kind of guarantee political rights to all individuals within a country, ethno-nationalism. So Pius XI has experience in Poland, John the 23rd in Bulgaria, Pius XII in Germany, and they're seeing this firsthand. So can you actually move sort of the individualism versus society already back to that earlier period, and also this question of human rights? Is that a solution to that problem?
Right. Well, there is no question but that Leo lived in a fairly serene time. He became really good friends with Bismarck, despite Kulturkampf. Bismarck received the highest lay medal of anyone. He and Leo worked it out. It was almost serene during Leo. He would have not thought of it that way. But with World War I, and Pius XI lives through that, and Pius XII, and you have the ideologies that are already gobbling up former countries of Christendom, and you have the Great Depression. Okay. Yeah, you're at another level of emergency and magnitude here. Yikes. He barely squeaked through with Quadragesimo. Because I say squeaked through because there's great stuff in it, by the way. In this sense, by the way, his encyclical on marriage, Casti Connubii, is forever. But he squeaked through because he died right after this. He made the Concordat with the Nazis, which was dead letter within 2 weeks. And he was getting old. And I think he's pretty confident that Pacelli would move it along. But look, Pacelli's in a terrible situation with the World War, of course. And he tried to want to be the peace negotiator between the Axis powers and the Allies. And about a year and a half before the war ended, in spring of 1945, the war in Europe, he got a private notice from Roosevelt. There will be no negotiation. Basically, you're out of this picture. Yeah, you don't have citizenship status on this one. And I think that sobered him up. Because after that, he wrote just these wonderful speeches. Acutely reasoned, beautifully delivered. But he didn't reach back for what he and Pius XII were doing in the 1930s. That's my best guess on that. See, John Paul II had an immunity. He's the first pope born in the 20th century. The first to die in the 21st. And because he was Polish, he knew what citizenship status meant. That is Poland even though it doesn't have its own government. And it's not just language. Poland is a real social entity because it's Poland and it's lived through this kind of stuff before. And if you read the 1958 essay on person and community, perfect. He explains what I'm calling the simple things. What is the bond? For what end? Perfectly. And I think this is why, when he became Pope, he didn't write a full-fledged social political encyclical for several years, more than a decade. And what's the first thing he was known? He did 3 on the Divine Trinity, and he started those Wednesday audiences on the original Unity. And if you read those audiences carefully, what is the form? What is the matter? What is the end? What makes this a real unity and not just a partnership? He's onto it right away. And I think that I don't chalk it all up to his Polish identity or so forth, but he knew the difference between a nation and a state. And you can start thinking analogously from that. He was not a diplomat. The language of a diplomat, it's all in the subjunctive. But the language of a teacher is not all in the subjunctive.
Please join me in giving a warm round of applause for Dr. Hittinger.
Thank you.
And please remember to join us down the hall for some after talk treats.